Today, we're looking at some of the writings of French intellectual René Guénon on the swastika. He lived between 1886 and 1951 and was a major figure in Parisian intellectual circle. He wrote a lot about metaphysics. Now, in this book, Fundamental Symbols, the Universal Language of Sacred Science, published sometime in the 1960s, written in French but translated eventually by experts in the field, he has a few interesting statements about the swastika. The swastika is far from being exclusively an Oriental symbol, as is sometimes believed. In reality, it is one of the most widespread of all, and it is to be found nearly everywhere, from the Far East to the Far West. For it even exists among certain indigenous people of North America. At the present time, it continues to be used, especially in India and in Central and East Asia, and it is probably only in this region that its real significance is still known, though even in Europe it has not disappeared entirely. In Lithuania and Poland, peasants still trace this sign on their houses. Doubtless, they are no longer aware of what it means and see in it only a sort of protective talisman. But perhaps what is most curious is that they give it the Sanskrit name swastika. In antiquity, this sign was particularly prevalent among the Celts and in pre-Hellenic Greece. Yet again, and still in the West, as Mr. Charbonneau-Lassay has remarked, it was one of the early emblems of Christ, and even remained in use as such until towards the end of the Middle Ages. Like the point at the center of the circle, and like the wheel, this sign incontestably goes back to prehistoric times, and for our part we see in it, without the least hesitation, one of the vestiges of the primordial tradition. One of the most striking figures, which sums up the idea that we have been expounding on the swastika, which is essentially the sign of the pole. It would seem, moreover, that in modern Europe, its true significance has never yet been made known. Vain attempts have been made to explain this symbol by the most fantastic theories, even to the point of seeing in it the outline of a primitive instrument for making fire. In fact, if it sometimes actually has a certain relationship with fire, that is for quite different reason. Most often it is made out to be a solar sign, which it could only have become accidentally and in a rather indirect way. We might repeat here what we said above in connection with the wheel and the point at the center of the circle. Those who have been closest to the truth are they who have considered the swastika as a symbol of movement. But this interpretation is still insufficient, for it is not a question of just any movement, but of a rotation around a center or an immutable axis. And it is precisely the fixed point that is the essential element to which the symbol in question directly relates. The other meanings which the same figure comprises are all derived from this one. The center imparts movement to all things, and as movement represents life, the swastika becomes thereby a symbol of life, or more precisely, the vivifying function of the principle in relation to the cosmic order. If we compare the swastika with the figure of the cross, inscribed in figure 2, we can see that fundamentally these are two equivalent symbols. But the rotation, instead of being represented by the tracing of the circumference, is indicated in the swastika only by the lines at right angle to the extremities of the branch of the cross. These lines are tangents to the circumference, which mark the directions of movement at the corresponding points. As the circumference represents the world, the fact that it is only implied, so to speak, indicates very clearly that the swastika is not a figure of the world, but rather of the action of the principle with regard to the world. we have not yet finished indicating all the meanings of the center. If it is first of all a point of departure, it is also a terminal point. All has come from the center, and all must finally return to it. As all things exist only by principle and could not subsist without it, there must be between them and it is a permanent bond, represented by rays joining to the center all points of the circumference. But these rays can be traversed in two opposite directions. First from the center to the circumference, and then returning from the circumference to the center. There are, as it were, two complementary phases. The first represented by a centrifugal movement, and the second by a centripetal movement. These two phases can be compared to those of respiration, according to a symbolism to which the Hindu doctrines often refer. And on the other hand, they have no less remarkable analogy with the physiological function of the heart. In fact, blood leaves the heart and is diffused through the organism which it vivifies, then returns to the heart, whose function as organic center is thus truly complete, and altogether corresponds to the idea that in a general way we must form of the center in the fullness of its significance. All beings dependent on the principle in all that they are must consciously or unconsciously aspire to return to it. This tendency to return towards the center has in all traditions its symbolic representation. We refer to ritual orientation, which is strictly speaking the direction towards a spiritual center, a terrestrial and perceptible image of the veritable center of the world. The orientation of Christian churches is only a particular case of this and relates essentially to the same idea which is common to all religions. To sum up, the center is both the principle and the end of all things. It is, according to a well-known symbolism, the Alpha and the Omega. Better still, it is the beginning, the middle, and the end. And these three aspects are represented in the monosyllable Om, to which Charbonneau-Lasset alluded and as an emblem of Christ, and the associations of which with the swastika among the signs of the monastery of the Carmelite in Luda seem to us particularly significant. In fact, this symbol, much more complete than the Alpha and the Omega and susceptible of meanings, which can be developed almost indefinitely, is by one of the most astonishing concordances that one could encounter, common to the ancient Hindu tradition and to Christian esotericism of the Middle Ages. And in both cases, it is also par excellence a symbol of the world, which is, in very truth, the real center of the world. This idea, expressed here more particularly, is therefore that of equilibrium. And this idea is really one with that of harmony. These are not two different ideas, but two aspects of the same idea. There is yet a third aspect to the symbolism, linked especially to the moral point of view, the admitting of other significations also, and this is the idea of justice. One can thereby relate to what we have just said, the Platonic concept of virtue as a just mean between two extremes. From a much more universal point of view, the Far Eastern traditions speak unceasingly of the invariable middle, which is the point where the activity of heaven is manifested. And according to Hindu doctrine, at the center of every being, as of every state of existence, there resides a reflection of the supreme principle. Equilibrium itself, moreover, is nothing other than the reflection in the manifested order of the absolute immutability of the principle. To see things under this new relationship, the circumference must be considered as being in motion around its center, which alone does not participate in this movement. The very name of the wheel immediately evokes the idea of rotation, and this rotation is the figure of the continual change to which all manifested things are subject. In such a movement, There is but one single point that remains fixed and immutable, and this point is the center. This brings us back to the cyclic concept we spoke of earlier. The course of any cycle, or the rotation of the circumference in succession, whether in temporal or some other mode. The fixity of the center is the image of eternity, where all things are present in perfect simultaneity. So the circumference can only turn around a fixed center. Likewise, change, which does not surface into itself, necessarily supposes a principle which is outside change. This is the unmoved mover of Aristotle, which again is represented by the center. Thus, at the same time, since all that exists, all that changes or moves has no reality, apart from the immutable principle on which it totally depends, this principle is that which gives motion its first impulse, and also that which subsequently governs and directs it, which gives it its law, the conservation of the order of the world being in a way nothing but the prolongation of the creative act. The principle is, according to a Hindu expression, the internal coordinator, the antaryami, for it directs all things from within, itself residing at the innermost point of all, which is at the center. Instead of a rotation of a circumference around its center, we can also consider that a sphere rotating around a fixed axis, the symbolic significance of which is exactly the same. This is why representations of the world axis are so numerous and so important in all the ancient traditions. And the general meaning of this last symbol is fundamentally the same as that of the figures of the center of the world, except perhaps that these figures evoke the function of the immutable principle with regard to universal manifestation more directly than the other relationships, under which the center may also be considered. When the sphere, terrestrial or celestial, revolves around its axis, there are on that sphere 2 points which remain fixed. These are the poles, which are the extremities of the axis, or its points of contact with the surface of the sphere. And this is why the idea of the pole is yet another equivalent of the idea of the center. The symbolism which relates to the pole, and which sometimes take on very complex forms, is thus to be found in all traditions, and may even be said to hold in them a place of considerable importance.